The champagne glass shattered against marble floors. But that wasn't the sound that changed everything. It was the laughter that followed my husband's laughter as he kicked me in front of his friends at our company's biggest celebration of the year. What Marcus didn't know was that the woman he just humiliated owned everything he thought belonged to him. Every dollar in his bank account, every brick of his office building, every employee on his payroll, all of it funded by my $47 million inheritance that I'd kept secret for 3 years. He thought he was kicking a helpless housewife. He was actually declaring war on someone who controlled his entire world. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how my cheating husband's cruelest moment became his biggest mistake, how his affair with our marketing director turned into federal criminal charges, how his plan to steal my fortune ended with him working night shifts at a warehouse while I built an empire from the ruins of our marriage. But here's what nobody expected, including me. The revenge I got wasn't what anyone saw coming. Not Marcus, not his mistress Isabella, not even my own mother who'd been pulling strings behind the scenes for months. This isn't just a story about catching a cheating spouse. This is about what happens when someone underestimates the quiet woman writing the checks, when charm and manipulation meet calculated justice, when the victim decides she's done being a victim. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, if you've ever wondered what real power looks like when it finally stops hiding, then you need to hear what happened next. Because this story has more twists than a soap opera and more satisfaction than any revenge fantasy you've ever imagined. Trust me, you won't see the ending coming. The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of our Austin penthouse, its crystal fragments catching the city lights like broken promises. My hands trembled as I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, forcing a smile across my lips with crimson lipstick. The bruise on my ribs was already darkening beneath my silk evening dress, a purple reminder of what my marriage had truly become. Tonight was supposed to be our triumph, the IPO announcement party, where Marcus would finally take TechFlow public, where we would celebrate 3 years of building something extraordinary together. The invitation list read like a who's who of Austin's tech elite venture capitalists, angel investors, industry journalists, and the employees who believed they worked for a self-made entrepreneur named Marcus Tatum. What none of them knew, what Marcus himself didn't know, was that every dollar of his success had come from my inheritance. Every brick of the downtown office building, every piece of cutting-edge cloud computing equipment, every salary we paid to our 130 employees, all of it funded by the trust fund my grandmother had left me when she passed 5 years ago. My name is Sarah Winters, and until 8 weeks ago, I thought I was living a fairy tale. Marcus swept into my life during a tech conference in Silicon Valley, all charm and ambition, speaking passionately about revolutionizing cloud computing architecture with artificial intelligence integration. He had the vision, the drive, the charisma to make investors believe in impossible dreams. His presentations were masterful, his business plan was solid, and his passion was infectious. What he lacked was capital. What he needed was someone who believed in his dream enough to fund it without asking for credit or control. I provided that capital through carefully disguised channels, wanting him to feel like the brilliant entrepreneur he believed himself to be, wanting our marriage to be built on partnership rather than financial dependence. I created shell corporations, anonymous investment vehicles, and complex financial structures that kept my identity hidden while providing Marcus with everything he needed to succeed. I was such a fool. The trust fund from my grandmother was substantial $47 million, carefully invested in diversified portfolios that generated enough passive income to fund Marcus's startup without touching the principal. I'd grown up modestly middle class, never knowing about the wealth that awaited me until after college. When the lawyers explained my inheritance in terms that made my head spin, the pregnancy test sat hidden in my purse, its 2 pink lines representing a future I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. 8 weeks pregnant, and I hadn't found the courage to tell my husband because I suspected he was having an affair. The timing felt like cosmic irony, discovering new life just as I was watching my marriage die. The signs had been obvious for months, growing more blatant as Marcus became more confident in his deception. Late meetings that ran past midnight with no documentation or follow-up emails, weekend conferences that couldn't be verified when I called the hotels, expensive cologne that wasn't the brand I'd bought him for Christmas, applied so heavily I could smell it on his shirts even after dry cleaning. New clothes from stores we'd never shopped at together. A gym membership he'd purchased without mentioning it, leading to a physical transformation that coincided perfectly with hiring Isabella Cruz as our marketing director. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Text messages that made him smile in ways that reminded me of our early courtship, except those smiles were no longer directed at me. Isabella was everything I wasn't: tall and willowy, where I was petite and curvy, with auburn hair that caught light like fire compared to my mousy brown waves. She dressed in designer outfits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, spoke with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own worth, and looked at my husband like he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered. But tonight, at our own celebration, surrounded by the business community we'd worked so hard to impress, I was going to confront the truth I'd been avoiding for months. Tonight, I would finally ask Marcus directly about his affair and force him to choose between his wife and his mistress. The limousine arrived at 7 sharp, its black exterior gleaming under the penthouse's exterior lighting. Marcus looked stunning in his custom tuxedo. Tom Ford, purchased with money from my trust fund, though he believed it came from our company's profits. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his smile broad with anticipation, and his eyes bright with the kind of excitement that used to be reserved for our intimate moments together. He helped me into the car with theatrical gallantry, playing the role of the devoted husband with the same passion he brought to his business presentations. His hand lingered on mine as he settled beside me, and for a moment I could almost pretend we were still the couple who'd fallen in love at that Silicon Valley conference 3 years ago. "You look incredible," he whispered in my ear as downtown Austin blurred past our windows, the city lights creating a kaleidoscope of color against the limousine's tinted glass. "This is our night, Sarah. Everything we've worked for comes together tonight. Our night, our work." If only he knew the truth about who had really built his empire, who had sacrificed their anonymity and independence to make his dreams possible, who had loved him enough to stay invisible while he basked in the spotlight of success that rightfully belonged to both of us. The grand ballroom at the Four Seasons was decorated in gold and black, elegant and sophisticated in the way that only serious money could achieve. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in white linen, each centerpiece a carefully arranged bouquet of white roses and gold accents that complemented TechFlow's corporate colors. The company's logo was displayed prominently on screens around the room, and I felt a complex mixture of pride and resentment seeing it there. I recognized most of the faces in the crowd: employees I had technically hired through intermediaries, investors whose money I had quietly matched through anonymous contributions, journalists who would write tomorrow's headlines about Austin's newest tech darling, board members who reported to shell companies that ultimately reported to me, though they had no idea their real boss was the quiet woman usually seen at Marcus's side during company functions. Marcus worked the room like a natural politician, shaking hands with the confidence of a man who believed in his own legend, sharing laughs and accepting congratulations for achievements that my trust fund had purchased. His charm was undeniable. He had a gift for making everyone feel like the most important person in the room, for listening intently to their concerns and responding with just the right mixture of humility and confidence. I smiled and nodded beside him, playing the supportive wife while my heart hammered with dread. Every congratulation felt like a lie. Every compliment about our success felt like theft. And every moment of Marcus's triumph reminded me how completely I'd erased myself from the story of our accomplishments. That's when I saw Isabella across the room, wearing a red dress that left little to imagination and commanded attention from every man within 50 feet. She was beautiful in that dangerous way that made men forget their wedding vows and women question their worth. Her auburn hair was styled in loose waves that cascaded over her bare shoulders. Her makeup was flawless in that effortless way that actually required hours of professional application. And her smile held secrets that promised trouble for anyone foolish enough to believe in their innocence. When her eyes found Marcus across the crowded ballroom, she smiled with the intimate knowledge of shared secrets, her tongue darting out to wet her lips in a gesture that was both unconscious and deliberate. Marcus's entire body went rigid beside me, his conversation faltering mid-sentence as he stared at her, like a man seeing water after days in the desert. "Who's the woman in red?" I asked Jake Reynolds, Marcus's best friend and business partner, though Jake had no idea his salary was paid by my inheritance or that his stock options were ultimately controlled by my shell corporations. Jake was a good man, technically brilliant but lacking Marcus's natural charisma and business instincts. He'd been Marcus's college roommate, his first employee, and the closest thing either of us had to family since both our parents had passed away. If anyone would tell me the truth about what was happening in my own company, it would be Jake. Isabella Cruz, our marketing director, Jake replied, then leaned closer with the uncomfortable expression of someone who knew they were about to cause pain. Between you and me, Sarah, she's been spending a lot of private time with Marcus. I probably shouldn't say anything, but as your friend, I thought you should know. My stomach clenched with the confirmation I'd been dreading. What kind of private time? I've seen them together after hours, in his office with the door closed and the blinds drawn, at restaurants across town where they think no one from the company will recognize them. Last week I came back to the office late to grab some files and saw them. Jake trailed off, his cheeks reddening with embarrassment. Saw them what? Kissing in the conference room. More than kissing, actually. They were so wrapped up in each other they didn't hear me come in. The confirmation hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd suspected for months. Watching Isabella walk across the ballroom toward our table, her hips swaying with predatory confidence, I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was knowledge, and knowledge demanded action. "Good evening, everyone," Isabella said when she reached our table, her voice husky and warm like expensive whiskey. "Marcus, you look very handsome tonight." The words were innocent enough, but the way she said them, with a slight breathiness that suggested intimacy, with eyes that lingered on his mouth before meeting his gaze, made them feel like a caress. Marcus's face flushed, but he couldn't look away from her. Neither could any of the other men at our table, which made Isabella's smile widen with satisfaction. "Isabella, this is my wife, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice slightly strained with the effort of appearing normal when every cell in his body was obviously screaming for the woman standing beside him. She extended a perfectly manicured hand, her red nail polish matching her dress and her lipstick in a way that spoke of careful coordination. "I've heard so much about you. Marcus talks about you constantly." "I'll bet he does," I thought, shaking her hand and noting that her grip was firm, confident, challenging. This wasn't a woman who backed down from anything she wanted, and it was clear she wanted my husband. "All good things, I hope," I replied, matching her smile while studying her face for tells, for any sign of guilt or discomfort at meeting the wife of the man she was sleeping with. "Oh, absolutely," Isabella laughed, a sound like wind chimes that made every man at the table lean slightly toward her. "He's always going on about how supportive you are, how you understand his dedication to work." Her eyes glittered with amusement that felt like mockery. "It must be so nice to have a husband who's so committed to his job." The double meaning wasn't lost on me, and from Jake's uncomfortable shift in his chair, it wasn't lost on him either. But the other men at our table, investors and board members, who saw Isabella as nothing more than an attractive employee paying their friend a compliment, remained oblivious to the knife she was sliding between my ribs with every word. Throughout dinner, I barely tasted the perfectly prepared salmon and risotto. My attention was fixed on the interplay between my husband and his lover, cataloging every glance, every smile, every casual touch that confirmed what Jake had told me. The way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, with the hungry intensity of new lovers who couldn't get enough of each other. The way Isabella's hand lingered on Marcus's arm when she leaned in to whisper something that made him laugh too loudly. The way he found excuses to touch her, adjusting her napkin when she dropped it, steadying her elbow when she reached for her wine glass, brushing an imaginary piece of lint from her shoulder. By the time dessert arrived, chocolate souffle that might as well have been cardboard for all I could taste, I felt nauseated, and not from morning sickness. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced as the waitstaff cleared our dessert plates, "it's time for our special presentation. Marcus Tatum, could you join me on stage?" My husband practically floated to the podium, basking in applause that my money had purchased, his smile broad and confident as he shook hands with the MC and accepted the microphone. He looked out over the crowd of employees, investors, and journalists with the expression of a man who had achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the packed ballroom. "When I started TechFlow 3 years ago, I had a vision of revolutionizing cloud architecture with artificial intelligence integration. I wanted to build something that would change how businesses think about data storage and processing. Started TechFlow. My vision, my revolution, my change. But I sat silently, my smile frozen in place, playing the role of the proud wife while my husband claimed credit for accomplishments that belonged to both of us. I couldn't have done any of this without the support of amazing people, Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping across the audience. My team, who believed in the vision even when it seemed impossible, my investors, who took a chance on an unproven startup, and most importantly, he looked right at me, and for a moment, I thought he was going to acknowledge my role, my sacrifice, my love, my incredible wife, Sarah, who has stood by me through everything. More applause. I waved like the proud spouse, feeling like a fraud while knowing I was actually the architect of everything being celebrated tonight. But tonight isn't just about celebrating the past, Marcus announced, his voice growing stronger with excitement. It's about announcing the future, and I'm excited to share some major changes coming to our leadership structure. Changes I hadn't authorized. Changes I knew nothing about. I felt ice water flowing through my veins as I realized something was happening that went far beyond a simple affair. Effective immediately, Marcus announced to the packed ballroom, his voice ringing with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled his own destiny. I'm promoting myself to chairman of the board, and I'm pleased to introduce our new chief executive officer, Isabella Cruz. The room erupted in applause as Isabella sauntered onto the stage in her red dress, every eye in the ballroom following her movement with the kind of attention usually reserved for movie stars or royalty. She kissed Marcus's cheek, lingering a moment too long for professional courtesy, and took the microphone with the poise of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Thank you all so much, she purred into the microphone, her voice carrying just enough breathiness to remind every man in the audience that she was, above all else, a woman who knew how to use every weapon in her arsenal. I'm thrilled to be taking on this new role. Marcus and I have been working very closely together to ensure this transition goes smoothly. Working very closely together. The double meaning hit me like a slap, and from the knowing looks being exchanged around the room, I wasn't the only one who caught it. This wasn't just an affair announcement. This was a corporate coup, executed publicly and designed to humiliate me while elevating both Marcus and his mistress to positions of power they had never earned. I sat frozen in my chair, watching my husband and his lover accept congratulations from a crowd that included my own secretly funded employees. The applause seemed to go on forever, a thunderous endorsement of their betrayal that made my ears ring and my chest tighten with panic. This wasn't just adultery, this was theft on a massive scale. Marcus was trying to push me out of my own company, replace me with his mistress, and he was doing it publicly, in front of everyone who mattered in Austin's tech scene. But he had made one crucial mistake that would ultimately destroy him. He still didn't know who really owned everything. When Marcus and Isabella returned to our table, they were glowing with triumph, their hands intertwined in a way that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Isabella sat in the chair that had been empty beside him, effectively pushing me out of the inner circle as colleagues congratulated them on their new partnership. This calls for champagne, Jake declared, though his expression seemed troubled as he signaled for a waiter. I caught his eye and saw confusion there, and something that might have been sympathy. Jake knew enough about TechFlow's financial structure to understand that what had just happened made no legal sense. As Dom Perignon flowed $1,500 per bottle, charged to company accounts that were ultimately funded by my trust, I watched Marcus's hand rest possessively on Isabella's thigh under the table. I watched them exchange meaningful glances loaded with promises of private celebrations to come. I watched my husband toast his betrayal with money I had provided, surrounded by people whose salaries I paid, in a building my shell corporations owned. The rage that had been building for months finally crystallized into something cold and calculating. Marcus thought he was so clever, so smooth, so irresistible. He thought he could steal my company, humiliate me publicly, and ride off into the sunset with his beautiful new CEO while I faded into irrelevance. He had no idea who he was dealing with. "Excuse me," I said, standing from the table with careful composure. "I need to powder my nose." Marcus barely looked at me. He was too busy whispering something in Isabella's ear that made her laugh like wind chimes, her head thrown back in exaggerated delight that drew admiring looks from men at nearby tables. In the restroom, I stared at my reflection in the gilt-framed mirror and felt a strange calm settle over me. The shock was giving way to clarity. The pain was crystallizing into purpose. The woman looking back at me had kind eyes and a gentle smile. But underneath that surface, something harder was emerging. Marcus thought he'd married a naive trust fund baby who would quietly accept whatever scraps of dignity he chose to leave her. He was about to learn that still waters run deep, and that the woman who had funded his empire was perfectly capable of destroying it. I touched up my lipstick with steady hands and returned to the party with a plan already forming in my mind. The evening continued with dancing and networking. Austin's tech elite celebrating what they believed was a brilliant strategic move by one of their rising stars. Marcus made sure to dance with Isabella multiple times, holding her close enough that her perfume would cling to his tuxedo, whispering in her ear while she smiled up at him with bedroom eyes that promised rewards for his public boldness. I danced with Jake, with investors, with board members who had no idea they were employees of my shell corporations, rather than independent directors. I smiled and made small talk about the exciting changes at TechFlow, playing the supportive wife who was thrilled about her husband's brilliant leadership decisions. Inside, I was planning. As the evening wound down, Marcus grew drunk on champagne and victory. Isabella hung on his arm like a trophy, her red dress a beacon of conquest that announced to everyone present that she had won whatever competition she'd been engaged in. His friends and colleagues surrounded them, offering congratulations and talking excitedly about TechFlow's bright future under new management. That's when Marcus decided to make his final, fatal move. "You know what, everyone," Marcus said, his words slightly slurred as alcohol loosened whatever restraints had been keeping him civilized. "I think it's time I was completely honest about something." The group fell silent, sensing drama coming. Even Isabella looked surprised by his tone, her smile faltering slightly as she tried to gauge where he was going with this unexpected announcement. "Sarah," he called out, beckoning me with a crooked finger like he was summoning a servant. "Come here, honey." I approached slowly, every instinct screaming that this was about to get much worse, but unable to avoid the spotlight he was creating without causing an even bigger scene. Marcus put his arm around my waist not lovingly, but possessively, his grip tight enough to keep me in place for whatever humiliation he had planned. Around us, investors and employees shifted uncomfortably, recognizing they were about to witness something that should have remained private. "I want everyone to know," Marcus began, his voice growing louder as alcohol and adrenaline combined to strip away whatever filter had previously governed his public behavior, "that my wife has been, how should I put this delicately, more of a hindrance than a help lately." Nervous laughter rippled through our group as Marcus tightened his grip around my waist, his fingers digging into my ribs hard enough to leave bruises. Isabella's eyes glittered with malicious delight, her red lips curved in a smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment for months. Around us, the crowd was growing larger as other party guests sensed drama unfolding and drifted closer to witness whatever spectacle Marcus was creating. I recognized faces from the business community, journalists with their phones discreetly positioned to capture whatever happened next. Employees who would have to face me in the office on Monday if I survived this with any dignity intact. "I mean, she's beautiful. Don't get me wrong," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the ballroom as he seemed to forget or simply not care that dozens of people were listening to every word. "But she doesn't understand business. She doesn't understand what it takes to succeed in this world. She's been holding me back with her constant questions and concerns about every little decision." My cheeks burned with humiliation, but I stayed silent, letting him reveal his true character to everyone present. Around us, I could see faces that had been smiling moments before, now showing discomfort, embarrassment, even disgust at what they were witnessing. Jake looked mortified, his face pale as he watched his best friend destroy his marriage in public. Several investors had stepped away, unwilling to be associated with what was clearly a personal breakdown happening at a professional event. But Marcus was too drunk on his own power to notice his audience was shrinking rather than growing. "That's why I need someone like Isabella beside me," Marcus pressed on, pulling his mistress closer with his free arm so that I was effectively sandwiched between him and the woman he was betraying me with. Someone who understands vision, who understands sacrifice, who understands what it means to build something revolutionary from nothing. From nothing, every word was a knife twist. Because Marcus knew, or thought he knew, that TechFlow had started with minimal capital and grown through his brilliant leadership. He had no idea that every dollar of growth had been carefully orchestrated by the woman he was publicly humiliating. "So here's to new beginnings," Marcus declared, raising his champagne glass in a toast that felt more like a declaration of war. "To leaving behind dead weight and embracing the future." That's when he did it, in front of his friends, in front of Isabella, in front of half of Austin's tech community. Marcus Tatum drew back his foot and kicked me in the ribs. The impact sent me stumbling backward, gasping in pain and shock as I fought to maintain my balance in high heels on the ballroom's polished floor. The sound of his Italian leather shoe connecting with my body was audible in the sudden silence that fell over our immediate area. "Whoops," Marcus laughed, not even pretending it was an accident as he steadied himself against Isabella. "Looks like you're in the way again. Honey?" The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Jake stared in horror, his mouth open in disbelief that his best friend had just physically assaulted his wife in public. Several investors looked appalled, clearly recognizing they'd just witnessed something that crossed every line of decency. Even some of the employees who had been enjoying the party looked uncomfortable with what their CEO had just done, but Isabella smiled like she'd just witnessed a beautiful sunset, her phone already in her hand as she discreetly recorded the aftermath of my humiliation for what I would later learn was her private social media accounts, where she bragged to friends about helping put me in my place. I pressed my hand to my ribs, feeling fire spread through my torso where Marcus's shoe had connected with bone. Tears of humiliation and rage burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give him or Isabella the satisfaction of seeing me break down completely. "You're right, Marcus," I said quietly, my voice somehow steady despite the turmoil raging inside me. "I have been in the way, but not anymore." I turned and walked away from the group, away from the party, away from the husband who had just shown me and everyone else exactly who he really was. Behind me, I could hear nervous chatter resuming as Marcus and his friends tried to pretend that what had just happened was somehow normal or acceptable. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The limousine ride home was silent, except for Marcus's occasional drunken laughter as he texted someone, undoubtedly Isabella, probably making plans for how they would celebrate his liberation from the burden of pretending to love his wife. I sat as far from him as possible in the spacious back seat, my ribs aching with every bump in the road. My mind already 3 moves ahead in a game he didn't even know we were playing. "You know," Marcus slurred as we pulled through the gates of our Westlake Hills estate. "Tonight went even better than I imagined. Isabella was incredible up there. Wasn't she? So professional, so competent, so perfect for the role." He paused, looking at me with eyes that held no trace of the man I'd fallen in love with. "Nothing like what I've been dealing with at home." "Nothing like your wife," I agreed, my voice flat and emotionless. He laughed, apparently finding my pain amusing. "Well, you said it, not me." "Not?" The car stopped in our circular driveway, and I slipped out before the driver could open my door. Walking quickly to our front entrance, while Marcus fumbled with tipping the driver and probably texting Isabella about extending their evening together. My hands shook as I unlocked the front door, not from fear or sadness, but from anticipation. Marcus thought he had won tonight. He thought he'd successfully humiliated me into submission while positioning himself and his mistress for a triumphant takeover of everything we'd built together. He had no idea he'd just walked into checkmate. I slammed the front door in Marcus's face and turned the deadbolt with hands that were finally steady, then walked calmly through the house I had purchased in my name alone to the security panel hidden behind a false cabinet in the kitchen. With deliberate precision, I entered the master code that activated every electronic lock on the property, the front gate, the garage doors, even the pool house where Marcus sometimes retreated when he wanted to make business calls in private. The soft beep of confirmation told me that Marcus was now locked out of what he believed was his own property, trapped in our circular driveway with nowhere to go except back to whatever hotel room or apartment Isabella maintained for their affairs. Through the kitchen window, I could see him trying his key in the front door. his confusion gradually turning to anger as he realized none of his access codes were working. His voice was muffled through the reinforced glass, but I could make out enough words to understand he was demanding I let him in, threatening legal action, alternating between rage and disbelief. I ignored him completely and began making phone calls. The first call was to James Mitchell, who had been my grandmother's attorney for 20 years before becoming mine. Despite the late hour, it was nearly midnight, he answered on the second ring, because he understood that middle-of-the-night calls from clients who controlled nine-figure trusts were never casual social calls. "Sarah, what can I do for you?" His voice was professionally alert, despite the late hour. "James, I need you to implement the financial protection protocols we discussed when I got married. All accounts associated with Marcus Tatum need to be frozen immediately, personal and business. Everything." There was a brief pause as James processed the implications of my request. "May I ask what's precipitated this action?" I touched my ribs gingerly, already feeling them stiffen with what would be spectacular bruising by morning. "Let's just say our marriage has taken an unexpected turn, and I need to protect the assets that were always mine to begin with." "I understand. How quickly do you need this implemented? Preliminary freezes within the hour, full documentation and legal notifications by morning. And James and I also need you to contact the board members of TechFlow's shell corporations. There was an unauthorized leadership announcement tonight that needs to be immediately reversed." "Reversed how?" "Marcus announced that he was promoting himself to chairman and installing his mistress as CEO. Since he has no legal authority to make either of those decisions, I need the real board to issue a statement clarifying the actual chain of command." "Understood. Anything else?" "Yes. I need you to prepare divorce papers, complete asset protection, acknowledging that all marital property was acquired through my separate trust assets. I want Marcus to walk away with exactly what he brought to the marriage, which was nothing." Us. The second call was to my security company, a firm that specialized in protecting high net worth individuals from various threats. Within 30 minutes, they would have technicians at my house changing every lock, resetting all access codes, and installing additional cameras with facial recognition software. Marcus's keys and codes would become worthless pieces of metal and meaningless numbers. The third call was to my private investigator, a former FBI agent named Margaret Stone, whom I'd hired 3 months ago when I first suspected Marcus's infidelity. Margaret had been gathering evidence ever since, building a comprehensive file that would destroy Marcus's reputation and potentially result in criminal charges for his misuse of company resources. "Margaret, it's Sarah. I need everything you have on Marcus and Isabella Cruz. Photos, recordings, financial documentation, everything." "I've got plenty," Margaret's gravelly voice confirmed. She'd been a federal agent for 20 years before going private, and she had the methodical thoroughness that came from building cases that had to hold up in court. Hotel receipts, credit card statements showing personal charges to business accounts, some very compromising photographs, and recordings of conversations that prove they've been planning this takeover for months. Recordings. "Your husband isn't as smart as he thinks he is. Isabella has been bragging to friends about her conquest, and some of those friends are more interested in protecting themselves than protecting her. I have recordings of her describing in detail how she seduced Marcus, how they planned to push you out of the company, even how they were going to divide up your assets after the divorce. How soon can you have everything delivered? Courier to your house by 7 a.m. tomorrow. Everything you need to destroy both of them, legally and professionally." Outside, Marcus was still banging on the gate, his voice growing more desperate and angry as he realized the scope of what was happening to him. His phone was apparently not getting through to Isabella, because I could see him checking it repeatedly between attempts to scale the electronic fence that surrounded our property. Let him wonder. Let him panic. Let him experience just a fraction of the helplessness and confusion he'd put me through for months. I finished the glass of water I'd been sipping, no wine, because I was still processing the loss of the pregnancy I discovered and lost in the same evening, and went upstairs to the master bedroom that would soon be mine alone. Marcus's clothes still hung in the walk-in closet I'd designed for him. His cologne still sat on the bathroom counter next to the his and hers sinks I'd thought were romantic when we built this house. His presence lingered in every corner, but by tomorrow night, all of that would be gone, packed up and removed by professionals who specialized in erasing people from lives they'd never actually belonged in. I ran a bath in the oversized soaking tub that overlooked our 3-acre backyard, letting the hot water soothe my bruised ribs while I planned the complete destruction of the man who had betrayed me. The physical evidence of Marcus's assault would fade within a few weeks, but the emotional and financial consequences of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. As I soaked in water that was almost too hot to tolerate, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months power. For too long, I'd been the silent partner, the hidden supporter, the woman behind the man who enabled his success while receiving none of the credit. Tomorrow, Marcus would learn exactly who held the real power in his carefully constructed world. But first, he would learn what it felt like to lose everything he'd taken for granted. I slept better that night than I had in months. Despite the ache in my ribs and the sound of Marcus honking his car horn sporadically throughout the early morning hours, he'd apparently given up trying to break into the house and was now sitting in his BMW in the driveway, probably calling lawyers and trying to figure out how his perfect plan had gone so wrong so quickly. I woke at 6 a.m. to silence. Looking out the bedroom window, I could see Marcus's BMW still parked in the circular driveway, but he was slumped over the steering wheel in what looked like exhausted sleep. His tuxedo was wrinkled and stained, his hair disheveled, and even from 3 stories up, he looked like a man whose world had collapsed overnight, which, of course, it had. Margaret's courier arrived at 7 sharp with a thick manila envelope that contained the documentation of Marcus's betrayal in excruciating detail. The photographs were particularly damning. Marcus and Isabella entering hotels during what should have been business hours, sharing intimate dinners at restaurants 40 miles outside Austin where they thought they wouldn't be recognized, kissing in the TechFlow conference room during a board meeting that had been called to address budget concerns. There were also financial records showing how Marcus had been systematically using company credit cards for personal expenses related to his affair. Jewelry for Isabella that cost more than most employees made in 6 months. Weekend trips to San Antonio and Dallas charged to TechFlow's travel budget, but with no business purpose or documentation. Restaurant bills for intimate dinners for 2, charged to client entertainment accounts when no clients were present. The total misappropriation was approaching $200,000, enough to constitute felony embezzlement in Texas, especially since Marcus had been fraudulently representing himself as the company's owner when he was actually nothing more than a well-compensated employee. But the most damaging evidence was the recordings Margaret had obtained. Isabella's voice, clear and unmistakable, describing to a friend how she planned to upgrade from being Marcus's mistress to being his wife and business partner. "The little mouse doesn't have a clue," Isabella's recorded voice purred with satisfaction. "She's so busy playing supportive wife that she hasn't noticed her husband is planning to divorce her and take half of everything she inherited from her grandmother. Marcus says she's worth $47 million, and Texas is a community property state. We're going to be very wealthy very soon." Except Texas community property law didn't apply to assets acquired through inheritance, especially when those assets had been carefully protected through prenuptial agreements and trust structures that James Mitchell had established years before I'd ever met Marcus. Isabella and Marcus had built their entire plan on a fundamental misunderstanding of how my wealth was structured. They thought they were stealing from a naive trust fund baby who had never bothered to protect her assets. They were actually trying to steal from someone who had spent years learning from the best attorneys and financial advisors money could buy. I dressed carefully for the confrontation I knew was coming, choosing a charcoal gray business suit that projected authority and competence. My ribs still ached from Marcus's assault, but I moved with purpose and determination. Today was the day Marcus learned who he'd really been married to. At 8 a.m., I walked out my front door and approached Marcus's car. He was awake now, his bloodshot eyes tracking my movement as I tapped on his window with one perfectly manicured fingernail. "We need to talk," I said when he rolled down the window. "About damn time," Marcus snarled, climbing out of his BMW with movements that spoke of a night spent sleeping in uncomfortable positions. "What the hell is wrong with you, Sarah? You can't lock me out of my own house. You can't freeze my credit cards. This is insane." "Nothing is wrong with me, Marcus. I'm finally thinking clearly for the first time in years." "Thinking clearly? You've lost your mind. Isabella is worried sick about you. We both think you might be having some kind of breakdown." I almost laughed at the idea that Isabella was worried about anything other than how my actions might affect her own plans. "Actually, I think Isabella has more immediate concerns than my mental health. I handed him a copy of the photographs and financial records Margaret had compiled, watching his face change from anger to confusion to dawning horror as he realized what he was looking at. Where did you get these? I've had you under surveillance for months. Marcus, I knew about the affair, I knew about the embezzlement, and I knew about your plan to steal my inheritance and run away with your mistress. Marcus stared at the photographs of himself and Isabella in compromising positions, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine settling on bankruptcy. This is illegal. You can't have people followed without their consent. Actually, I can. You're my husband, and I have every legal right to investigate potential financial crimes being committed against me. I pulled out another document, the preliminary freeze orders James had obtained overnight. Speaking of which, you should know that all accounts associated with your name have been frozen pending a criminal investigation into embezzlement. Criminal investigation? Marcus's voice cracked like a teenager's. Sarah, you can't be serious. Those were legitimate business expenses. $200,000 in hotel rooms, jewelry, and romantic dinners. For what business purpose? Exactly. Marcus opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air, apparently unable to come up with a plausible explanation for how taking his mistress to expensive restaurants could be considered a business expense. Look, I made some mistakes, he finally admitted, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he used when he wanted something. I got carried away. I acted stupidly. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling. I can make it up to you. I can cut all contact with Isabella. It's too late for that. Marcus. I handed him another document, divorce papers, that had been drawn up according to the prenuptial agreement he'd apparently forgotten existed. You have 48 hours to vacate any properties you don't own, which is all of them. Marcus stared at the divorce papers with growing panic. You can't do this. I built TechFlow. I created something from nothing. You can't just take it away. I didn't take anything away. Marcus, I'm simply reclaiming what was always mine. That's when I told him the truth he should have known all along. The truth that would have changed everything if his ego hadn't been so massive that he couldn't see past his own reflection. Every dollar you ever had came from my trust fund. Every success you claimed, every achievement you celebrated, every moment of pride and accomplishment, all of it was purchased with my inheritance. You didn't build TechFlow, Marcus. I built it, using your face and your charm as a front because I wanted you to feel successful. The color drained from Marcus's face as the magnitude of his situation finally became clear to him. That's impossible. I have ownership documents, incorporation papers, board positions, all of which trace back to shell corporations, that trace back to holding companies, that ultimately trace back to my grandmother's trust. I smiled with genuine satisfaction as I watched years of arrogance and self-deception crumble in real time. You were never more than a well-paid employee. Marcus, a very well-compensated face for a company you never actually owned. Marcus stared at me with a mixture of rage and disbelief, finally understanding that the woman he'd been betraying and humiliating was the same woman who controlled everything he'd thought belonged to him. You lied to me for 3 years, he whispered. I protected you for 3 years. I let you believe you were successful because I loved you and wanted our marriage to work. But last night, when you kicked me in front of your friends and your mistress, when you humiliated me publicly while announcing your plan to replace me with another woman, that's when I decided it was time for you to learn the truth. But even as I savored Marcus's shock, I had no idea how much more complex this situation was about to become. 3 days later, I received a phone call that made my blood run cold and reminded me that in chess, sometimes the pieces you think you control are actually being moved by players you can't see. Sarah, we have a serious problem. James Mitchell's voice was tight with what sounded like panic, which was alarming because James had been handling complex legal situations for wealthy families for over 30 years. Very little rattled him. What kind of problem? Marcus has produced what appears to be a prenuptial agreement that I've never seen before. It's dated 2 weeks before your wedding, properly notarized and witnessed, and it essentially waives all your rights to TechFlow while limiting you to a modest settlement in case of divorce. The phone slipped in my suddenly sweaty palm. That's impossible. We never signed a prenup. You advised against it. Remember you said the trust structures would provide adequate protection? I remember our conversation clearly. But Sarah, this document has your signature on it. It looks authentic. The handwriting analysis I ordered came back positive. The notarization is legitimate, and the witnesses are people who were actually present at our office during that time period. My legs gave out and I sank into the nearest chair. You're saying I signed a document I have no memory of signing. I'm saying someone has produced evidence that suggests you did. And if this prenuptial agreement is legitimate, Marcus has a strong legal claim to TechFlow, regardless of how the company was originally funded. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Everything I'd done over the past 3 days, freezing accounts, changing locks, filing for divorce, could be reversed if Marcus could prove we had a valid prenup that gave him ownership of the company. James, I need to see this document immediately, and I need you to explain to me how it's possible that I signed something in your office without remembering it. I'm already on my way to your house. I hung up and immediately called Margaret, my private investigator. If Marcus had somehow forged my signature on a prenuptial agreement, she would be able to prove it. Margaret had contacts in forensic handwriting analysis, document authentication, and fraud investigation that rivaled what law enforcement agencies used. Margaret, I need you to investigate something urgently. Marcus claims we signed a prenup that I have no memory of signing. I need to know if it's genuine or forged. I'll start making calls immediately. But Sarah, you should know I've been getting some strange inquiries about my investigation into Marcus. Someone else has been asking questions about what I've uncovered. What kind of someone? Professional someone? The kind of someone who knows how to ask questions without revealing who they're asking for. I think you might have other enemies in this situation besides your husband and his mistress. Other enemies? The phrase sent chills down my spine as I considered who else might have motivations to destroy my marriage and steal my assets. Business competitors, perhaps, or someone from Marcus's past who saw an opportunity to profit from our divorce. When James arrived an hour later, he brought a file that contained the most professionally executed fraud I'd ever seen. The prenuptial agreement looked completely legitimate, proper legal language, appropriate signatures, official notarization, but as I stared at what was supposedly my own signature, I felt certain I'd never seen this document before. James, I need you to be completely honest with me. Is there any possibility that I could have signed this and forgotten about it? Any medication or stress or circumstance that might have affected my memory? James studied my face carefully before answering. Sarah, I've known you for 15 years. You've never signed any document in my office without reading every word at least twice and asking detailed questions about the implications. The idea that you would sign a prenuptial agreement that essentially gives away your entire inheritance without extensive discussion is completely inconsistent with your character. So it's forged? I believe so, but it's a very sophisticated forgery. Whoever did this had access to samples of your handwriting, knew the proper legal procedures, and had connections to legitimate notaries and witnesses. Who could have arranged something like this? Someone with significant resources and detailed knowledge of your personal and financial situation? Someone who's been planning this for months or even years? The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. Marcus wasn't smart enough to orchestrate this level of sophisticated fraud on his own. Isabella was manipulative and ambitious, but she'd only been in our lives for 4 months. This prenuptial agreement was supposedly signed 3 years ago, which meant someone else was pulling strings I hadn't even known existed. There's something else, James continued, his expression growing even more grave. I've been contacted by another attorney who claims to represent your interests, someone you supposedly hired 6 months ago to handle your divorce proceedings. That's impossible. You're the only attorney I've ever hired. That's what I told them. But they have documentation suggesting otherwise, retainer agreements with your signature, communications authorizing them to act on your behalf, even copies of privileged information from your trust accounts. I stared at James in growing horror. Someone had been impersonating me for months, hiring attorneys, signing documents, accessing my financial information. The betrayal went far deeper than Marcus's affair or Isabella's ambitions. James, I think someone has been stealing my identity for legal and financial purposes. This isn't just about my marriage. This is about someone systematically taking control of my entire life. Who would have the access and motivation to do something like this? The answer came to me with the force of revelation, terrible and undeniable. There was only one person who had complete access to my financial information, who knew all my legal strategies, who understood exactly how my trust was structured and how to manipulate those structures for their own benefit. You, I whispered, staring at the man who had been my family's attorney for 20 years. It was you. James's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a coldness that replaced the concern he'd been projecting. Sarah, that's a very serious accusation. How much did he pay you? James, how much was my trust worth to you? For a moment, James said nothing, and in that silence, I understood that everything I'd trusted, everything I'd built my security on, had been compromised from the very beginning. $2 million, he finally admitted, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, and a promise of ongoing legal work when TechFlow goes public and Marcus needs more sophisticated corporate counsel. The betrayal cut deeper than Marcus's kick had, deeper than Isabella's mockery, deeper than anything I'd experienced in my entire life. This wasn't just about my husband cheating. This was about the systematic theft of my identity and my future by the man my grandmother had trusted to protect our family's interests. My grandmother trusted you for 30 years. Your grandmother is dead, Sarah. Marcus is very much alive, very determined to succeed, and very willing to pay for expert assistance in achieving his goals. So you helped him forge documents to steal my inheritance. I helped him protect himself from a wife who was hiding the extent of her wealth. He had every right to know what he was marrying into, and he had every right to protect his interests in case the marriage didn't work out. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. James had been working with Marcus for months, possibly from the very beginning of our relationship, setting up legal structures that would allow them to steal everything while making it look legitimate. But as I sat in my living room, staring at the man who had helped raise me after my parents died, who had walked me down the aisle at my wedding, who had been like a father to me for most of my adult life, I realized that this betrayal might actually be the key to my ultimate victory, because James Mitchell had made one crucial mistake. In his eagerness to help Marcus steal my assets, he'd left a paper trail that could destroy both of them. But before I could begin to fight back against James and Marcus's conspiracy, disaster struck from a completely unexpected direction. The next morning, I woke to find news vans parked outside my house and my phone buzzing with calls from reporters whose numbers I didn't recognize. Miss Winters, a journalist called out as I stepped outside to retrieve my newspaper from the circular driveway. Do you have any comment on the FBI investigation into TechFlow's financing? FBI investigation. My blood turned to ice water as I stared at the reporter, a young woman with sharp eyes and a digital recorder already running. I rushed back inside and turned on the local news to see Marcus and Isabella in handcuffs being led from the TechFlow building by federal agents. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Tech startup executives arrested in securities fraud investigation." The reporter continued, Marcus Tatum and Isabella Cruz were taken into federal custody this morning on charges of defrauding investors by misrepresenting the ownership structure of TechFlow Industries. Federal investigators allege that the pair convinced venture capital firms to invest millions of dollars in a company they claimed to own, when in fact the business was secretly controlled by shell corporations with unknown beneficial owners. This was impossible. I controlled those shell corporations, and I'd never filed any complaints with federal authorities. I'd been planning to use the evidence of Marcus's embezzlement to force a favorable divorce settlement, but I'd never intended to involve federal law enforcement. Someone else had triggered this investigation, someone with access to financial records that should have been confidential, someone with detailed knowledge of my business structures and Marcus's role in the company. My phone rang, and James Mitchell's name appeared on the caller ID. I almost didn't answer, given what I'd learned about his betrayal the day before, but I needed to understand what was happening. "Sarah, don't say anything to anyone," he said without preamble, his voice tight with panic. "The FBI has been investigating TechFlow for months. They have wiretaps, financial records, communications between Marcus and Isabella discussing their plan to defraud investors. But I never reported any fraud to federal authorities. Someone else did. Someone with very detailed knowledge of your financial arrangements and Marcus's deception. The federal prosecutor says they have an informant who's been providing extensive documentation for over 6 months. 6 months. That meant whoever had triggered this investigation had been planning it since before Isabella ever entered our lives, since before Marcus's affair had become obvious, since the very early stages of whatever conspiracy had been building around me. Who could have that kind of access to our financial information? I don't know. But Sarah, this is bad for all of us. If the federal government seizes TechFlow's assets as part of this investigation, it won't matter what the prenup says or who actually owns the company. Everything gets frozen until the criminal case is resolved, and that could take years. I hung up on James and immediately called Margaret, my private investigator. If someone else had been feeding information to the FBI, she might have some idea who it was. Margaret, I need to know if you've shared any of your investigation with federal authorities. Absolutely not. Everything I've uncovered is covered by attorney-client privilege through your relationship with James Mitchell. There was a pause. But Sarah, I told you yesterday that someone else has been asking questions about my investigation. Professional questions? From someone who knows how federal investigations work? What kind of questions? Questions about whether I'd uncovered evidence of securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering. The kind of questions that suggested whoever was asking already knew the answers and was trying to determine if I might interfere with their own investigation. The implications were staggering. Someone had been running a parallel investigation into Marcus and TechFlow. Someone with the resources and connections to trigger federal law enforcement action. Someone who wanted Marcus destroyed, but didn't necessarily care whether I survived the destruction. Margaret, I need you to find out everything you can about who initiated this FBI investigation. I need names, motivations, everything. I'll start making calls. But Sarah, you should know that federal investigations like this usually have multiple sources and multiple motivations. Whoever did this might not be working alone. I hung up and walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the news vans and federal agents who were now treating my home like a crime scene. My husband was in federal custody. My company was under investigation for securities fraud. My attorney had been revealed as a conspirator in a plot to steal my inheritance. And somewhere out there, someone I hadn't identified yet was orchestrating events that were spinning completely beyond my control. That afternoon, Isabella called me from federal detention, her voice shrill with panic and rage. You did this, she hissed through the prison phone system. You destroyed everything because you couldn't handle losing Marcus to a better woman. I didn't report you to the FBI, Isabella. I had no idea this investigation was happening until I saw it on the news. Bullshit. Who else would? She stopped mid-sentence, and I could practically hear the gears turning in her head as she considered other possibilities. Unless, oh my God, your mother. My mother. I hadn't spoken to Diane Winters in over 2 years, not since our last argument about my decision to marry Marcus. She'd been opposed to the relationship from the beginning, claiming that Marcus was obviously a fortune hunter who would eventually try to steal my inheritance. My mother has nothing to do with this. Doesn't she? Marcus always said she was dangerous, but I thought he was exaggerating. The famous Diane Winters, the woman who destroyed 3 competitors through hostile takeovers and federal investigations. Isabella's voice was gaining strength as she connected dots I hadn't even seen. She's been watching you, hasn't she? Waiting for Marcus to reveal his true nature so she could swoop in and clean up the mess while taking control of your assets? The accusation hit me like a physical blow because it made a terrible kind of sense. My mother had built her technology empire in the 90s through a combination of brilliant innovation and ruthless destruction of anyone who stood in her way. She'd retired as one of the wealthiest women in Texas, but she'd never lost her taste for complex strategic victories. She's using you, Sarah, Isabella continued, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. This whole thing is just another hostile takeover to her. She doesn't care about your marriage or your feelings or your company. She wants control, and she's willing to destroy everyone around you to get it. I hung up on Isabella, but her words echoed in my mind as I considered the possibility that my estranged mother had been manipulating events from the shadows. Diane Winters certainly had the resources, connections, and strategic mind necessary to orchestrate something like this. She also had the motivation she'd never approved of Marcus, and she'd always believed I was too trusting and naive to protect myself from predators. But would she really destroy my marriage and my company just to teach me a lesson about the dangers of the world? As I stood in my empty house, surrounded by evidence of betrayals I was still discovering, I realized that the answer was almost certainly yes. My mother had always believed that the only way to develop proper judgment was to be thoroughly betrayed by those you trust most. It appeared she'd decided to arrange that education personally. That evening, as federal agents finished processing the TechFlow offices and Marcus remained in custody awaiting arraignment, I received a phone call that confirmed my worst suspicions about who had been orchestrating this entire catastrophe. "Hello, darling." The voice was cool, cultured, and utterly confident, my mother's voice, unchanged by the 2 years since our last conversation. "I imagine you're having quite an eventful week." "Hello, Mother." I kept my own voice steady, though my hands were shaking with a combination of rage and disbelief. "Enjoying the morning news. I am indeed. Very satisfying to see justice served. Don't you think? Justice, is that what you call destroying my marriage and my company? I call it education. You needed to learn some difficult lessons about trust, power, and the true nature of the people around you. Sometimes the only way to develop proper judgment is to be thoroughly betrayed by those you trust most." I sank into my living room chair, finally understanding the scope of what had been done to me. "You've been orchestrating this entire situation? The FBI investigation, James's betrayal, even Marcus's affair. You've been pulling strings I didn't even know existed." "Not orchestrating, darling, simply facilitating. Marcus's true nature was always evident to anyone who cared to look. Isabella's predatory instincts were obvious from her employment history. James's susceptibility to corruption was clear from his gambling debts and expensive lifestyle that far exceeded his legitimate income. You investigated my husband, my lawyer, and my employee behind my back. I protected my daughter from people who were planning to destroy her. The fact that you were too naive to see their true intentions doesn't make my actions wrong, it makes them necessary. By having Marcus arrested on federal charges, by ensuring that when Marcus inevitably revealed his true character, there would be consequences for his actions rather than rewards. Did you really think I was going to let him steal $47 million from my daughter and walk away unpunished?" I stared out my living room window at the news vans that were still camped outside my house, their satellite dishes and cameras pointed at the home I'd built with stolen money and broken dreams. "What happens now? Now you decide what kind of woman you want to be. You can remain the trusting, generous person who gets taken advantage of by everyone she meets, or you can become someone who understands how power really works in this world. Someone like you. Someone who understands that power unused is power lost. You inherited wealth, Sarah, but wealth without wisdom is just a target for predators like Marcus and Isabella. And James. James will be disbarred and likely prosecuted as a co-conspirator once the federal investigation expands to include his role in the document forgery. I have recordings of every conversation he had with Marcus about stealing your assets." Recordings. "I've had James's office under surveillance for 8 months. I suspected he might eventually betray you. He always was too easily corrupted by flattery and money." The scope of my mother's preparation was breathtaking and terrifying. She'd been planning for this confrontation since before Marcus's affair had even begun, setting up surveillance, gathering evidence, building criminal cases against everyone who might threaten me. What about TechFlow? What happens to my company? TechFlow will be seized by the federal government as part of the securities fraud investigation. Its assets will be frozen, investigated, and eventually sold at auction to recover investor losses. My mother's voice held the satisfied tone of someone whose long-term planning was finally paying off. "And who do you think will be in the best position to purchase those assets at auction? You. We, Sarah. We will purchase your company back for pennies on the dollar, with clean title and no messy legal complications. Your shell corporations will be dissolved as part of the federal investigation, but the underlying assets will be transferred to new entities we control jointly." I closed my eyes and tried to process the magnitude of what my mother had done. She'd destroyed my marriage, ruined my husband, eliminated my crooked lawyer, and arranged for my company to be sold back to me at a fraction of its value, all while teaching me painful lessons about trust and betrayal. "You could have just warned me about Marcus and James. You could have shown me the evidence and let me make my own decisions. Would you have believed me? Would you have been willing to see Marcus sent to prison and Isabella destroyed? Would you have had James disbarred and prosecuted?" I considered the questions honestly. 3 months ago, if my mother had approached me with evidence of Marcus's affair and James's betrayal. I probably would have tried to find some gentle solution that preserved everyone's dignity while protecting my interests. Probably not. Exactly. You would have confronted Marcus privately, given him a chance to explain himself, maybe agreed to counseling or a trial separation. You would have fired James quietly and found a new attorney without pursuing criminal charges. And in 6 months or a year, you would have found yourself divorced, broke, and facing years of litigation while Marcus and Isabella lived comfortably on money they stole from you. My mother was right, which made her rightness feel even more hollow. I'd wanted agency in my own revenge, the satisfaction of destroying the people who'd betrayed me through my own cleverness and planning. Instead, I'd been a passive observer in a chess game where I hadn't even known I was a piece rather than a player. What happens now? I asked again. Now you come work with me. I'm restructuring Winters Industries to include technology acquisitions, and I need someone who understands the industry from both technical and business perspectives. You'll be my partner rather than my employee, and you'll learn how to exercise the power you've inherited instead of hiding from it. And if I refuse, then you continue making the same mistakes that led to this situation. You find another Marcus, another Isabella, another James, and in a few years, we have this conversation again. I hung up without agreeing to anything, but we both knew I didn't have much choice. My husband was in federal prison. My company was seized by the government. My lawyer was under criminal investigation, and my trust fund was managed by shell corporations that were about to be dissolved. Working with my mother was the only path back to the kind of security and power I'd taken for granted before Marcus's betrayal. But first, I needed to understand exactly what price I would be paying for my mother's protection. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Winters Industries, looking down at downtown Austin through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more per square foot than most people's annual salaries. The federal investigation had concluded with guilty pleas from Marcus, Isabella, and James Mitchell. Marcus received 18 months in federal prison for securities fraud and embezzlement. Isabella got 12 months. James was disbarred and sentenced to 2 years, though he would likely serve less than one with good behavior. TechFlow's assets had been auctioned by the federal government, and my mother had purchased everything for $8.7 million, less than 20% of the company's actual value. She'd restructured the business as a subsidiary of Winters Industries, with me as president and her as chairman of the board. You should feel vindicated, my mother said, joining me at the window with 2 cups of coffee that cost more than most people spent on lunch. Everyone who betrayed you is facing appropriate consequences. I don't feel vindicated. I feel manipulated. You were manipulated, Sarah, by Marcus, by Isabella, by your attorney, even by your own naivety about human nature. I simply used their manipulation against them more effectively than they used yours against you. Without my consent, without even telling me what you were planning, if I'd told you my suspicions about Marcus 6 months ago, would you have agreed to federal prosecution? Would you have been willing to see him sent to prison? I considered the question honestly. 6 months ago, I'd still been in love with the man I thought Marcus was, still hoping our marriage could be saved, still naive enough to believe that confronting problems directly would lead to honest solutions. Probably not. Exactly. You would have tried to find some gentle resolution that preserved everyone's dignity while protecting your assets. That's admirable in theory, but it's also how wealth gets stolen and naive people get destroyed by those who understand power better than they do. My mother was right, but her rightness felt hollow. I'd wanted to be the architect of my own revenge, to experience the satisfaction of outmaneuvering the people who'd betrayed me through my own intelligence and planning. Instead, I'd been protected like a child while adults handled the difficult decisions. What happens now? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Now you learn how to be the kind of woman who doesn't need protection because she's too dangerous to cross. You learn how to see people's true motivations before they can use those motivations against you. You learn how to exercise power instead of hiding from it. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor that reminded me why I needed my mother's protection in the first place. Jake Reynolds stood in my office doorway, looking nervous and ashamed, carrying a manila folder that contained his resignation letter and a personal apology for his failure to warn me more forcefully about Marcus's affair. "I know you probably don't want to see me," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. I know I should have done more to protect you from what Marcus and Isabella were planning. You tried to warn me, Jake. I wasn't ready to hear what you were trying to tell me. I was a coward. I knew what was happening, and I didn't speak up forcefully enough because Marcus was my friend, and I didn't want to believe he could be that cruel. I studied Jake's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. He'd been the only person in Marcus's inner circle who'd shown any integrity during the crisis. The only one who tried to alert me to the affair even when it cost him his friendship with Marcus. "There's a place for you here if you want it," I said, surprising myself with the offer. TechFlow is being rebuilt as part of Winters Industries, and we need people who understand both the technology and the industry. After everything that happened, especially after everything that happened, I need people around me who choose integrity over loyalty to friends who don't deserve it. I need people who understand that sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that people you care about are capable of terrible choices. Jake accepted my offer, and over the following months, he became my closest advisor and the person I trusted most to help rebuild what Marcus had destroyed. He brought technical expertise, industry connections, and most importantly, the hard-won wisdom that comes from watching someone you trust destroy themselves through their own poor choices. 2 years later, I stood on the balcony of my new office, looking out over the Austin skyline as the sun set over a city where I was no longer known as Marcus Tatum's naive wife, but as Sarah Winters, co-owner of one of Texas's most successful technology companies. Phoenix Technologies, the company we'd built from TechFlow's ashes, employed over 300 people across 4 states and was on track to generate over $50 million in revenue within the next fiscal year. Under my leadership and Jake's technical direction, we'd grown far beyond anything Marcus had ever imagined possible. The business world had embraced my transformation from victim to victor, and I'd become something of a symbol for women who refused to be destroyed by betrayal. Speaking engagements, magazine covers, and consulting opportunities flowed toward me like recognition that was long overdue. But the sweetest vindication was simpler and more personal. Marcus had been released from federal prison 8 months ago. He now worked the night shift at a warehouse outside San Antonio, living in a studio apartment and driving a 15-year-old Honda that barely passed state inspection. He tried to contact me several times through intermediaries, offering apologies and begging for reconciliation, but I'd ignored every attempt. He was no longer worthy of my attention, positive or negative. Isabella had served her sentence and tried to rebuild her career under an assumed name. But the business world has a long memory for scandal, especially when that scandal involves federal criminal charges. Last I'd heard through industry gossip, she was working as a bartender in a small town in New Mexico, her dreams of power and luxury permanently shattered by her own greed and poor judgment. James Mitchell had been disbarred and spent 14 months in federal prison. He now worked as a paralegal for a personal injury firm, his prestigious legal career destroyed by his decision to prioritize easy money over professional ethics. My mother and I had developed a working relationship that would never be warm, but was built on mutual respect and shared goals. She taught me that survival in business sometimes requires ruthlessness, while I'd reminded her that victory without some measure of compassion is ultimately hollow. "Miss Winters, your 3 o'clock appointment is here," my assistant announced through the intercom. "Send her in." Shorty, The door opened to admit a young woman who looked remarkably familiar, not in physical appearance, but in the defeated posture and frightened eyes that I remembered from my own reflection during the worst days of my marriage. She was probably 30, with dark hair and the kind of expensive clothes that suggested wealth, but not the confidence that should come with it. Behind her walked an older man, who was clearly her attorney, carrying files that probably contained evidence of betrayal similar to what I'd experienced. "Miss Winters," the attorney began, "this is Jennifer Martinez. She's in a situation very similar to what you experienced with your ex-husband." I gestured for them to sit and listened as Jennifer told her heartbreakingly familiar story. A wealthy young woman who'd fallen in love with a charming entrepreneur, funded his business ventures while staying in the background, only to discover he was planning to divorce her and claim half of everything she owned while continuing his affair with his business partner. "I saw your story in the news," Jennifer said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know, is it possible, can someone like me really fight back and win?" I smiled and reached for a legal pad, feeling the satisfaction that comes from turning painful experience into useful knowledge. Jennifer, let me tell you something I learned the hard way. Power that's hidden is power that can be stolen, but power that's acknowledged, documented, and legally protected, that's power that can change the world. Over the next 2 hours, I outlined a strategy that would not only protect Jennifer's assets, but would expose her husband's infidelity and financial misconduct in ways that would end his ability to victimize other women. It felt good to use my hard-won knowledge for justice, rather than just revenge, to help another woman avoid the mistakes I'd made while achieving the victory I'd ultimately claimed. As Jennifer and her attorney left, I returned to my balcony overlooking downtown Austin. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me of the fire that had been forged in my chest the night Marcus kicked me in front of his friends and mistress. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably sitting in his studio apartment after another 10-hour shift at the warehouse, wondering how his perfect plan had crumbled so completely. Somewhere else, Isabella was learning that consequences eventually catch up to everyone, no matter how beautiful or manipulative they think they are. And here I was, standing in the center of an empire I'd built from the ashes of my destroyed marriage, helping other women find their own strength and power while building something far more valuable than anything Marcus had ever imagined possible. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Miss Winters, my name is Catherine Walsh. I read about you in Forbes magazine. I think I need your help. My husband doesn't know I own the pharmaceutical company he thinks he's running. He just announced his engagement to his secretary. Can we meet?" I smiled and typed back immediately, "My office tomorrow at 10 a.m. Bring all your financial records and documentation of your husband's infidelity. Time to teach another man that there are consequences for betraying powerful women." Marcus had thought he could break me, humiliate me, steal from me, and discard me like yesterday's newspaper. Instead, he'd freed me to become something magnificent and unstoppable. He'd wanted to leave me behind as dead weight, convinced that I was nothing more than a trust fund baby who would collapse without his guidance and protection. Instead, he'd given me the motivation to become the kind of woman who turns betrayal into triumph, who transforms pain into power, and who helps other women do the same. The irony was perfect. In trying to destroy me, Marcus had created his own worst nightmare, a woman who was not only wealthy and intelligent, but who now understood exactly how cruel and manipulative people could be. A woman who had learned to see through charm and charisma to the motivations beneath. A woman who would never again be anyone's victim. As night fell over Austin, I stood in my office surrounded by the empire I'd built from betrayal, knowing that this was just the beginning. There were more women out there like Jennifer, like Catherine Walsh, like the woman I used to be, wealthy but naive, powerful but hidden, generous but unprotected. And there were more men out there like Marcus, charming but empty, ambitious but unscrupulous, willing to steal from the women who loved them if they thought they could get away with it. My mission was clear: to ensure that fewer women fell victim to such predators, and that when they did, they had the resources and knowledge necessary to not just survive the betrayal, but to transform it into something better than what they'd lost. Marcus had kicked me in front of his friends because he thought it would demonstrate his power over me. Instead, it had been the moment I'd finally understood that the only person who could protect Sarah Winters was Sarah Winters herself. And my revenge had been everything he never expected, not the desperate actions of a woman trying to win back her husband's love, but the calculated moves of someone who had finally learned to value herself more than she valued other people's approval. The champagne glass had shattered that first night, its fragments catching the light like broken promises. But from those fragments, I'd built something far more valuable than the marriage I'd lost. I'd built a life that was entirely, completely, magnificently mine. And that's how a woman who was kicked in front of her husband's friends ended up owning an empire while he works the night shift at a warehouse. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what people expect, it's giving them exactly what they deserve. What did you think of Sarah's transformation? Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely underestimated you? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. I read every single one. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button to help other people discover it. Stories like Sarah's deserve to be heard, and your support helps us share more incredible tales of justice, revenge, and women who refuse to stay quiet. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell because we post new revenge stories every week. From cheating spouses to toxic bosses to fake friends who get exactly what's coming to them, we've got the stories that will restore your faith in karma. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage of all. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up giving us the motivation we need to become unstoppable. Thanks for listening to Sarah's story. Until next time, remember, still waters run deep, and the quiet ones are often the most dangerous. See you in the next one.